the model is behaving, can we do a make good analysis, and how can we keep this game alive? And so that is kind of an area which, I've lately started hearing a lot around actionable feedback back into your model. So it's very critical that you spend some time in this space. And our first attempt, when we tried to do this, if you think of a project with 100% total time, as you can see, we've spent an awful lot of time on this data side, right? I mean, we did something, increased the ask part, story was some time, feedback, I'm being generous here, it's I think a smaller yellow dot than this, because the first time the drum roll happened the moment we provided the story. So, and these are again not good, projects which apply a decent amount of analytics. But if you're spending most of your time here, imagine what you exactly are doing in these two. You may be hiring labor economists, and you may be hiring, mathematicians and statisticians and storytellers. You might risk them in this space if you really don't understand how the distribution of time is in these four areas. And these are our next few attempts. Like we did a Salesforce effectiveness work where we spent we learned a lot from the business, from HR, and it's very, very critical not to isolate HR. We learn a lot from our business partners. Then we started focusing on, do we have external data, and how does that relate to the project? My analytical team said, God, I would love to have more time on this, but I don't, because you're rushing me into visuals being done, story being told, and then presenting it to our audience. And then we kind of had that early drum roll. We had done some turnover prediction model for some of our markets where we spent a lot of time on understanding. So you can see that it balanced off, even though the sizes of green and blues, varied. The big red in this case was we were working with 30,000 data points at a given time, about 100 plus variables in the model. But when we got the data from our global clients and tried to load it into SPSS, the issue was not about having access to the data. The issue was about converting the data and plugging into our models. And then we had, do all this, and then at least the good news is we got invited to a post hoc analysis, and that was a success for us. So my point is that it varies from company to company, but you need to understand where you fall and how much time you spend and how efficient you are. And again, as I said, we're trying to minimize the data side, being more effective, and increase on the other three buckets. So this actually becomes very important in terms of you need to understand how much of your analytical team understands HR and how much of your HR understands analytics. So if you plot yourself where you are in this map, it I think makes it a lot more easier to go and try to solve this kind of an agenda and try to be more holistic and inclusive and have an identity for HR. So as I said again, like capability building in isolation, right? Typically, this might be a super overlap for some. It might not even be connecting for some. But I think my general observation has been that we kind of say that we have an analytical team, but how much of HR does know how to come to you, when to come to you? How much of HR do we in the analytics community know about? And the more and more I learn about HR, the more interesting it becomes that this has to be a very rock solid integration. And in this graph here, this is kind of what we're plotting in. We are engaged with HR in many projects. We are kind of in this stage here where we have overlapped in many markets. And the goal is actually to be an integral part of the HR community. On paper, these sound very good, like people say that this is what we do, but when you really open the skin and peel the skin of the onion here, you're not even close. So you need to think about on those four stages, particularly the last stage, on how you engage with HR. And real quick on an example here, and I'm not going to go into details of it. So this was our what we call the global operations team. We're looking into does workspace changes have any impact on productivity? And so they had a business case for it. So they partnered with us in understanding how do we leverage people data to this puzzle, and what can we do as a team. So here is a question which came straight from our business team through our HR business partner community to us. So what we tried to do is it was not our agenda was not to solve the problem, but it was we were able to solve part of the problem, where we said that we could look at what impact does workspace change have on someone's decision to leave. And then we said that we helped them in, there are certain factors which didn't come significant and were not drivers. And we said that let's not invest time in places which does not have an impact on the overall human capital outcome, like engagement, turnover, and productivity. So as you said, like this was a good start for us. But again, the first 3 stages went pretty good, but the last stages where we are improving on this particular project. So again, the question is, do workplace-related changes impact a colleague's decision to leave the company, right? So real quick, the as stage was we explored with the business community, the HR community, trying to build a 6-page research proposal. All our first stages have a full-blown research proposal, and we do that in combination with HR and the business client. And we leverage data. We use survey-based and non-survey-based applied factor analysis here. Then analyze the plan using logistic regression, which is a pretty straightforward exercise to see what drives into the impact of prioritizing what efforts. And this was in multiple cities across the world. This is typically a proposal which goes in every project of ours, where for this particular project, it was a 6-page proposal where we have research questions, we have diagrams, we say what statistical analysis we apply, we say what variables we have, we don't have. So it's a full-blown analysis which gets approved by the entire team, which includes both HR, in this case, finance, and my team. Again, real quick on this, I mean, we leveraged external research factors. We said what are factors which are impacted by workspace and what are not. And again, this was a combined exercise and not just the analytical team. And that's my entire point in this discussion, that have a collaborative environment with your HR team. Do not do this in isolation. And then we kind of leverage survey-based independent variables and non-survey-based independent variables. Again, just examples of how these are things which came out of our factor analysis. And then some rationale of why we used as a workplace-related improvement, which came in this next step, where we looked at cohesion and cooperation, we looked at flexibility and openness. And then we kind of went into this model of did the logistic regression and basically did a predictor ranking and an impact and odds ratio here, and also explained what each meant. So when we came to this stage of the story, we already knew, the team knew exactly how to do it because they were part of the factor analysis session. They were part of like the entire group. It was not that they gave us a problem, we went into hibernation, we came up with a model. And that does not work. So we kept them alive throughout the engagement. There were parts when we were doing all the background analysis in SPSS. Obviously, we did not show them the full-blown 40, 50 pages of output results. That doesn't make sense. So we kind of explained this, and then we did this on 6 cities across the world and tried to explain like what factors drive, what other analysis have you done, the global operations team? How much overlap is between what we are saying to what they are finding? What are the areas where you should not be thinking about? And how does this, build a business case for you? So if you really look at the way we used analytics in this example is we gave them the people side of the mix, how we can get better. And this was not like, probably I wouldn't say like the #1 project I've had. We've done more complex analysis of prediction, but this was one of the few first projects for us here which could tell what my team's capability are and what we can offer. So that was more a success for us in this particular agenda. And again, as I said, the outcomes of this have been applied, and there are certain markets where we kind of proved it wrong, that they were investing in the wrong spots. So again, a good example of how analytics can be applied. And again, my closing points would be, think of a holistic system, think of the feedback, think of collaborating with HR and business, and be open to your thoughts when you try to get into an analysis. Do not jump into data right away and start trying to solve the problem. Again, I'm going to end with this as data, story, and feedback. And Mihaly, I think I'm at time right now, correct?
Yeah, thank you very much, Arun, for this fantastic presentation. Very interesting. And now we're moving on to our next speaker, Stela Lupushor. Stela, the stage is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can view my screen. I'll get into the projector mode. Fantastic. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you so much, Stanford Global and Mihai, the overall team, for this opportunity to share a little bit about the story behind the numbers at my current company. My name is, again, Stela Lupushor, and I'm a director of Force Analytics at TIAA-CREF. Those of you who might not have had the chance to know much about the TIAA-CREF brand, we are a large financial institution, almost 100 years old. We'll reach centennial in 1918. And it's primarily focused on delivering financial services and products to nonprofit organizations, people in academia, people in government. We manage not only retirement portfolio, but assets. They allow us to manage on their behalf. And we're absolutely committed to making a lifetime financial well-being possible for all of those who cannot do it without us and by themselves. We serve more than 16,000 institutions, and that comprises about 5 million individuals overall that we provide these services to. And we have about 900 billion assets under management and holdings in more than 50 countries. And currently we are at about 14,000 employees, companies, and rapidly growing to support the demand in our services. And one of the challenge that I'll talk about is looking at the reason for attrition, and hopefully some of the stories I'll tell will resonate with some of you who are attempting or have attempted to do the same. But before we dive in, I'd like to understand a little bit more about your experience and what you do. So, Mihai, with your help, if we can launch the first poll, that'll be great.
Yes, so ladies and gentlemen, here's the first question. What data are you using to understand why people leave the company? Please do put your answers, select all that apply. What data are you using to understand why people leave the company? Whether you're using exit surveys, engagement surveys, external social media, or others. And waiting for some answers in the next few more seconds. And I'm closing the poll because the data hasn't really moved that much. What's interesting, 86% of our audience said that they're using exit surveys, 53% using engagement surveys, 12% using external social media, and 29% of our audience use some sort of other form of data to understand why people leave the company.
Very interesting, and it's somewhat consistent to what we in my team have experienced too. So I think the trusted source will continue to be the exit surveys until we move to more of a real-time feedback, and the data quality and the richness from those other sources becomes more available and higher quality. I have another question. What type of analysis you do around attrition in general?
So let me launch the second poll. What type of analysis do you do around attrition? Please select all that apply. Exit survey analysis, turnover trends, predictive attrition, nothing yet, or some sort of other way of analysis. I'm waiting for the answers to coming in fairly rapidly. So if I share the answers, you can see that 35% of our audience use exit survey analysis, 77% turnover trends, 21% prediction attrition, predictive attrition, 19% nothing yet, and 6% use some other form of analysis.
Great. So again, it's consistent, and it's great to see that the predictive attrition is growing in its use, especially when it comes to attrition. And again, I think the story of these two polls is there is not a single perfect answer. And every company chooses to start with something that they have data around, and then take it from there and grow over time. And that's exactly what we've done at TIAA-CREF. we have a typical survey problem. It is conducted by a third party, and we don't have an attrition problem to begin with. So the sample size and the data availability is rather small. And that also leads to the fact that it's difficult to share the results with the HR business partners, since it may reach the minimum threshold of what we can share. We run into other issues, such as we do have data over time for many years. However, there has been a lot of shifts in the organizational structure. There has been new business units that formed. There are new acquisitions. So the data itself, it's not as easily analyzable, so to speak. You have to do some serious manipulation of the aggregate at the aggregate level to be able to see the trends year over year and how it changes. So we said, all right, before we take one last look on whether we continue with the process as it is, let's just do an overall analysis with the team we have at TIAA-CREF. So we started with the questions, why people are leaving us. Would they recommend us as a company to other employers? Would they recommend the products we sell? So thinking more about the Net Promoter Score they leave behind. Do they perceive the environment in which they work effective or not? And where are they going to? What type of companies are they leaving us for? And again, in the next few slides, I'm not going to dive into the actual details, since obviously this is a sensitive topic, but I will share the approach we took and some of the things we looked at in order to produce the insights we did. So what we did, we took the data in aggregate across all the business units we had, across all the years we had, across all different evolutions of the questions we asked, and we tried to make sense out of it so we can have a consistent set of data to look at across the board. We did a lot of segmentations, and I'll talk a little bit later in a few minutes about what those were. And then we created visually appealing results, more very simple graphs, because that helped us tell the story in a much easier way and convey the messages we needed to convey based on the data and the results we saw. In addition to that, we also brought in a few other data types. So we, of course, the survey, exit surveys are only what they are. So it's the people who chose to answer those surveys who left us. But we also brought in the actual turnover analysis. So how many people left by which group, just to show the actual size of the data and the fact that the survey results were only telling a partial story of that turnover. And then we also brought external data. So we looked at some of the social media sites that evaluate company brands, and we supplemented the analysis and provided some of the insights coming out of the external perspective about the company. So what did we find? What was interesting? I probably would speak for everyone when it comes to looking at some of the data, especially when it comes to attrition. Everything seems to be interesting, and you get little nuggets from different cuts and different deep dives that you do. We put together a story, and the story was organized in a very consistent fashion. So we explained what data we analyzed. We explained the current process to gather the data. We explained the methodology that we used to do the analysis, the types of segments we looked at, and then every page that we had in that report was representing different insights. So the data themselves in graphs, as well as the insights you need to pay attention to or understand based on what those graphs tell. And then at the end, we share the recommendations. So what were the segments? The typical dimensions you'll expect to see, right? So tenure, and obviously there is a tipping point in the tenure based on which people decide to leave or stay. So that was an interesting segment for us that later on we used to recommend to pay attention or more attention to that segment. since that's where people typically may make a decision to leave. We looked at the ethnicity, and of course we found some interesting concentrations of certain reasons in certain ethnic groups. We also, of course, looked at the performance ratings because no company likes to lose their top performers, especially. And we also found certain types of reasons why top performers leave us. We looked at age groups. And again, there is a certain age bracket where people make that choice. And obviously, it's a group that you need to pay more attention and determine how can you keep them more engaged, or what are the retention factors that we need to put in place to make sure we don't lose that group. And then the other interesting segment we looked at, of course, was gender, and we found that there are different sets of reasons for leaving between women and men, and that was very insightful for us to see. Then we took at the year-over-year trends, and more for us the interest was, is there a significant increase in certain types of reasons or decrease? And obviously there were a significant increase in 3 of those, so that helped us focus our effort afterwards to determine where we do deep dives for analysis. Then we also wanted to understand what happens after people leave, so which companies they go to, and of course we found the top 10 companies and some of the same companies that we hire from, so that was an interesting fact, not that it was not known, but we had the evidence now to put in front of the leaders. Also, we looked at the position, would they recommend the product and the company, and we're very excited to see that people do like the services we offer, and they would recommend us as a great place to work. So regardless, for whatever reason they leave us, they still keep us as more of a alumni referral for the company and the products we offer. And in addition to that, there is more. We also, as I mentioned earlier, looked at the external social media. So we brought in data from Glassdoor and Indeed and Career Police. Additionally to that, we did some text analytics on the free-form answers. So that also revealed some interesting key major themes that people share when it comes to the feedback they leave about the company. What was the final recommendations? We looked at different roles and how we can influence the understanding of the business leader, since ultimately it is the business, the managers that have an influence, a direct influence on the decision of that person to leave or stay. HR can only recommend and influence that environment. So for HR business partners who have the closest ability to the business to have that influence and that conversation, a recommendation was to have more frequent discussions with the business leaders about those specific segments we identified at risk. Of course, looking more at work-life programs and specialized for the types of roles they support, and then better articulate career path, because perhaps people leave because they don't understand what the long-term opportunities that they have in the company to grow. When it comes to talent acquisition group, we obviously recommended that they take a closer look at the relationship between the job description and the actual job responsibilities people have when they come in, and this ties back more to the attrition of those who leave within 1 year from hire. And then for the HR leadership team, we recommended to rethink the approach to exit surveys overall. Of course, the options ranged from stopping the surveys altogether, linking the results to some of the engagement survey results, as well as taking more advantage of that external perspective and managing the employment brand in a slightly different way. So bringing the social media content and the ratings on Glassdoor and others. And then for our team, we couldn't contain ourselves because that gave us so much more interesting ammunition to do more deep dives. So we started looking at the retirements, what are the brain drain potential, what risk do we have coming? Do we even even have that problem at all. We started doing some of the deep dives into social media content. We want to take a look at the career velocity analysis, a little bit more deeper dive into top performers, attrition, as well as the impact of training. So we have our hands full, but if we think about the overall employee experience, we want to start with the end of it and what are the drivers for people leaving us or disengaging, and then start looking up the stream of that experience and understand what influences that, and then how can we impact in a positive way so people decide to stay and continue to stay engaged. And with that, that's the story about the work we've done on the exit surveys analysis. If you have any questions, please.
Thank you very, very much, Stella. There's one question came in first, is which analytics did you use to determine turnover variables?
Turnover variables. When we look, it's the typical traditional dimensions, right? So you look at the age, at the performance level, at their business units they belong to, at the ethnicity, tenure with the company, and we try to test for each of those, which of those have the biggest concentration within certain termination reason codes. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you do identify certain concentrations, and that's the message we went back to HR business partners and say, you really need to pay attention to these groups because they are the highest risk you have.
Yes, there is one more question, Karen. Did you use employee survey data to predict turnover?
No, we have not used that. I suspect those with more mature analytics organization can attest. When it comes to predictive analytics, it takes a certain level of expertise within the team, as well as understanding and ability to wrap their head around the prediction model, especially in HR. So I think on that account, on the latter, we're not there yet, number one. Number two, I think prediction is just that, right? The probability that something may or may not happen. So we really need to tread carefully when it comes to, especially the topic of attrition, because there is a human behind that. And when you say, well, this segment or this group or this individual is at risk of leaving, it doesn't mean that they will leave or they even have it in their mind that they plan to leave. It's just that they belong to that segment. And by just telling that to the manager or the HR business partner, they may make the wrong assumption and potentially give up on that person only because they belong in that segment. So when it comes to the attrition prediction, we try to be very careful and make sure the organization is ready for that type of analysis before we dive into that. And it's going to happen eventually, and we start with that exit survey just to share the facts first, and then eventually grow that maturity of thinking to the prediction level. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. And of course, it's a very important message. Let's not forget that behind whatever data we see, there are human beings we are dealing with, and that's very important. So let's not jump for the wrong conclusion just because data suggests. So I think that was a very powerful message, and thank you for that. Okay, thank you very much, Stella, for the fantastic presentation. Those of you, of course, interested in meeting Stella in person, she will be leading a pre-conference workshop at the Workforce Analytics Summit in New York on 9-10 June. And with that, I'd like to introduce the last, but not least, the last presenter for the day. And with that, Boyce Byerly finishing up our little session today.
Thank you very much, Mahalo. My name is Boyce Byerly, as he said. I'll be representing my consultancy, Level 6 Analytics, today, rather than Quintiles, as the data and case studies I'll be talking about didn't originate with Quintiles. This webinar, Business Impact of Turnover and Retention, will be more of a how-to presentation. In this webinar, I'd like you to be able to, when you're done, calculate turnover and retention, describe what each of those tells you, break down good versus bad employee loss, describe what you can learn from descriptive statistics on turnover and retention, to be able to measure turnover costs, and be able to utilize different tools for analyzing turnover and retention. Turnover is undoubtedly a pretty serious problem, both in terms of being widespread among companies and serious within a company. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the turnover rate is about 12% generally. In many industries, it's a lot worse, such as in the restaurant industry, where it's closer to 40%. Even in state government jobs, it's still about 4 to 5%. The costs are usually fairly serious. Standard, widely supported estimate for white-collar knowledge workers is that it costs 18 months of salary to replace the worker. And why is it so expensive? Well, the calculations involve low productivity, the cost of training a new employee, loss of relationships with colleagues and customers, loss of specialized knowledge, advantages gained by the competition, and especially if a prize worker goes there, and recruiting costs to replace the employee. There are different ways of analyzing turnover and retention, which I'll shorten to be T and R, where I'm not trying to distinguish between turnover and retention. Turnover and retention is a very nuanced area of measurement, and we'll look at a number of different aspects. First off, what are we measuring exactly? Is it turnover or retention? A superficial analysis might suggest that turnover and retention are just the inverse of one another, that turnover is who has to be replaced and retention is who stays. We'll establish particular definitions for each and show that the two numbers are very different metrics. Knowing both may provide a lot more information depending on the business and the industry. Where we're speaking generally about the topic, and it's not usual to distinguish, again, we'll talk about T and R. It's important to distinguish between good and bad turnover. The impact of an employee removed because of a performance or a behavior problem is very, very different from a high performer who left during a growth period to join the competition. And both of those are different from a layoff or a person who leaves for retirement or a spouse move, for example. We'll talk about how much working out, how to work out the costs of a turnover. We'll talk about how can we break it down for demographics to better understand it. How do we consider tenure? Tenure is one of the most important of the variables. We'll go far into that. And we'll talk about exit interviews, one of the ways of looking at the data to understand why are people doing this, to get some qualitative data in. Engagement is, again, the flip side of the exit interviews. Why are people staying? And we'll do some work on that. Finally, we'll talk about, as an analysis tool, the relationship between T&R and specific investments. For example, does training improve retention? So with that, here's some formal definitions of turnover and retention. Remember, retention and turnover are related, but they're very different measures. Now, retention is just the percentage of employees who are present at the beginning of a time period who are also there at the end. And that time period is usually a year, although it may make sense to deal with shorter or longer periods if you have special cases. So that's the equation. The original still employed at the end of the period divided by the number employed at the start of the period. Now, turnover is the number of departed employees divided by the average number of employees for a given time period. So that's the number departed during that period by the average, the active at the start plus active at the end, divided through by 2. Now, are both of these numbers necessary? Well, yes. There's some special cases, such as low turnover environments, where retention may be very close to the inverse of turnover. However, each of these metrics has its own strength. Retention may be a very unique indicator of organizational health in cases of high turnover, where who you keep is very crucial. Turnover is more of a focus on replacement costs. Retention is focused on preserving knowledge and other intangible human capital. Turnover is simply looking at the short-term costs of the process. So turnover is used more in areas where there's an adequate pool of low-cost labor and they're less knowledge-intensive. Fast food is probably the best example of that, where replacement costs are the focus. So let's address the question more directly whether both are needed. Let's investigate a simple scenario where both are measured under some extreme conditions. we'll look at a department that only has 4 employees, and we'll look at 3 different cases. The first is the high turnover scenario at the total turnover scenario, where all 4 employees left and were replaced. The second is a high turnover at one position scenario, where 3 of the 4 employees stayed, but the remaining position was filled by 5 different people. And finally, a high turnover in every position scenario, where each of the 4 positions turned over 3 times during the year. Now, notice that the first 2 scenarios have the same turnover rate of 100%. However, the retention rate is 0% in the first scenario, and the second retains 75%. The first and third scenarios retain 0% of their employees, but the turnover is 3 times as bad in the third scenario, 100% versus 300%. It's important to note that not all employee losses are equal. Now, recall the cases we mentioned earlier, the contrast of an employee dismissed for cause to the escape of a valued employee to a competitor to the regrettable necessity of a layoff. Also recall the contrast of someone leaving dissatisfied compared to the inevitability of someone leaving upon retirement. Now, one fairly standard nomenclature due to Wayne Casco at Wayne State is to refer to loss as either regrettable, which can be broken down into avoidable, which is the key thing that we want to analyze, versus unavoidable. Of course, the flip side of regrettable is non-regrettable, which we're assuming to be acceptable. Now, this is a theoretical definition of this. What do we get in the real world? And I'd like to poll the audience to say, what kind of information do you record for terminations?
Okay, I'll launch the poll in a minute. What information do you record for terminations? I'm awaiting the answer from the audience. Please select all that apply, don't know, not applicable, voluntarily, involuntarily, employee stated reason for leaving, manager stated reason for leaving, future plans, going to a competitor, moving, etc. So I'm waiting for the answers to come in. What information do you record for terminations? Yes, and as you can see, in the responses that 90% of our respondents said voluntary or involuntary, so that's some information they record. 67% record it's an employee stated reason for leaving, 45% manager stated reason for leaving, 39% future plans, going to a competitor, moving, etc. And don't know, not applicable, it's only 2%.
Okay, thank you. As we see, their systems don't really throw things into nice little piles like regrettable or avoidable for you. So there's usually some important clues that will allow you to make your own categories to make sense within your corporate culture. So here are some of the things that we often see within our categories. As our poll very strongly echoed, a voluntary versus involuntary classification is very typical. Now, generally we assume voluntary losses are regrettable and involuntary ones aren't. And you can break these down further. The worst, of course, is an employee going to the competitor. Retirement is a somewhat neutral one you should certainly see coming at least. Pregnancy is another common one. Of the involuntary ones, didn't meet a performance quota is a common one. Termination for performance or behavior issues is typical, something that typically has to be done, unfortunate. Drug test failures is another typical one. Of course, you can always think further ahead and analyze these a little deeper. The first thing you should do with an employee who's pregnant is have a baby shower and a going away party, but you might also want to think about your company's child care policies and part-time options, as young moms are often great workers if you're willing to consider their restrictions and work around them. For employees who fail to perform, are there job aids, equipment, or training that might have made the difference in their performance overall? For those that failed a drug test, was there counseling available? Or if you're in the rock and roll music business, are drug tests even a good idea? Well, let's talk a little bit about breaking T&R down by demographic. There are a lot of ways you can break your employees down demographically. The specifics will be determined by your organization, or at least by the data it collects. Now, once you have the data loaded in, it will usually be easy to flip through a number of possible segmentations of the turnover. We encourage you to do this. Often a segmentation will uncover interesting things that you hadn't expected. These graphics suggest a few possible segmentations: region, job role, ethnic group. Another segmentation that's very important that I'm getting ready to dive into is performance. If you're looking at a group of employees that are managed by some common performance metrics, such as sales number, customer satisfaction, or call handling time, this is a great way to look at the data. If you really want to separate out regrettable and non-regrettable turnover, there's no way better to do it than with performance data. If you don't have a business metric, see if you have human resources data that could serve as a proxy for it, such as performance reviews or merit pay. Now, tenure is another very important variable you need to segment TNR. First, tenure strongly predicts whether an employee will leave. The longer an employee's been there, the less likely they are to leave. Most turnover happens when the employee's not been there for very long. Second reason tenure is so important to the TNR analysis is that the cost of losing a senior employee is much greater. They're likely performing at a higher rate and have a larger share of institutional knowledge. Thus, the retention metric is particularly related to tenure compared to turnover. Now, here's a data set that shows the relationship between retention, turnover, and performance. The data is from a retail automotive sales environment. There are a pair of graphs on this palette. The upper one here shows active employees, and the lower graph represents employees that have been terminated. Now, the vertical axis in each of the two graphs represents sales, with 0 sales per month being at the bottom of the two graphs, with sales increasing as you go up. The horizontal axis represents tenure, with brand new employees on the left side and the most experienced employees to the right. Now, consider employees with higher sales, where we'll say that from 8 cars a month and up is high sales. Now, I've highlighted that in red. Notice those who sell a lot of units are pretty unlikely to leave, if you look at the terminated section down here on the bottom graph. Of course, if the employees do leave in these cases, there's a much higher cost than those that weren't selling anything. Okay, now let's look at tenure. Let me separate out people with more than 10 years of tenure. Again, those who have been there fairly long seem fairly unlikely to leave. Almost all the termination happens in less than 10 years. Actually, most of it happens in the first couple of years. Of course, if they leave, if the high tenure people leave, then that's a much bigger loss to the company. So if you add these performance squares together and look at them, these are people who have left in orange here that have more than 10 years of tenure and are selling more than 10 units a month. You see there's virtually no chance whatsoever of people that have high tenure and are selling a lot of cars or being likely to leave. So the main takeaways here that I want you to get from these two rather complex graphs are that tenure and performance strongly predicts employee loss, and that tenure and performance affect the cost of employee loss. Well, with strong effect of tenure's impact on the cost of losing a particular employee, it may not be readily apparent to you how you analyze your data in a way that helps make sense of things. There are some powerful statistical techniques, certainly, but we won't assume too much, and we'll instead suggest a simple technique: splitting your participants into cohorts. Now, cohorts is a word that implies you separate people into groups on similarities, usually something time-related, such as when the person was hired or when someone entered college. You might just look at retention rates for people hired in a particular month of 2005, as this graph suggests. Now, this graph doesn't use anything in the way of statistics, but it makes a very clear argument that the fully trained people, shown in dark blue, and the untrained people, shown in light blue, have pretty significant retention rates differences. Now, this technique, I might note, is hard to apply to turnover, at least in any straightforward way. There are a number of important costs related to turnover and lack of retention. Here are some great resources that will help you with their calculations online, but we'll just content ourselves with a simple laundry list of what the main areas are for now. They're divided into separation costs, such as exit interviews, admin functions, severance pay, and increase in unemployment taxes. vacancy cost, which include the net cost minus salary savings of increased overtime or temporary employees needed, training cost, or replacement cost rather, cost of attracting, interviewing, and testing applicants, moving expenses, and pre-employment admin expenses, training costs, bringing the new employee up to an acceptable knowledge level to perform their job, and performance differential costs, diminished productivity during the warm-up period for new employees. Now, let's talk about some of the specific tools that we have for gaining more qualitative information about TNR. Exit interviews. Well, if you want to know something, just asking people is the obvious technique. It's important to get the employee perspective on things. Do they feel their chances for advancement were limited? Was the company's child care policy too inflexible? Did they not feel their input was valued? Were there work processes that were unnecessarily frustrating? Second perspective might be the HR or management perspective. Was the employee asked to leave because they weren't productive? Were they tempted away by more money? Well, don't expect the answers to agree from different perspectives. Terminations often have significant emotional issues involved, and here's some of the reasons why those perspectives may be different. Many employees are going to be searching for a new job. They won't want to burn their bridges and get a bad reference, so they may sugarcoat their problems with management. It's not uncommon for management to dismiss a poor performing employee, but hopes the person will succeed elsewhere, not want to damage their future employment hopes. Many people have difficulty facing up to how they contributed to a problem and have incentives for denying their contribution. Litigation related to termination of employment, prejudicial references, is common enough to affect people's thinking. The best data that we've seen coming out of exit interviews use third parties for interviewing after some time has passed. Let's examine the other side with a polling question and find out, why do you stay in your current job?
So the poll is coming up. Why do you stay in your current job? Please do share what's your most important reason. So select one that's the most important to you. Why do you stay in your current job? The answers are coming in nicely. Let's wait for a couple more seconds. As you can see, most people stay in the current job because they enjoy the work they do, work-life balance, benefits, pay. 33% enjoy the work they do, 24% because of a work-life balance, 20% of the answers because of benefits, pay, 16% of the respondents mentioned that feel connected to the organizations, and only 6% stay in a current job because there are no other opportunities.
Thanks. Engagement surveys get at a lot of the major ideas behind retention, and that's really what we just did. On some occasions, companies have actually done surveys that explicitly ask employees why they were staying, as we just did, although it does seem a little awkward to suggest why management wouldn't understand why you'd want to stay. So the crux of the engagement question is, why do people say they stay? You might ask about their relationship with management, their optimism about the future, satisfaction with processes, and so on. Now, it's worth noting that why people stay and why people go do not match up very well. And that's one thing that worries us about the survey processes related to retention, namely that these semantic reasons don't line up very well. For example, people frequently cite salary as their number one reason for leaving, but it's seldom cited as a reason to stay. In one pair of studies we saw done in the same year, of the top 10 reasons for staying, surveyed from a general business environment, only one of them matched up with the reason for leaving in another big study across a general business environment. Another thing you might want to consider qualitatively about retention and turnover is looking at particular programs and doing some scientific study along those lines. Do certain programs improve retention? And I'll abstract out from the dozens and dozens of different companies I've worked with to show some of the things that I've found have improved TNR numbers and that may be studied in your organization. Training is almost always improving retention. Of all the studies we've done over the years, we've only seen one case where training didn't increase the likelihood of a person staying. And many, the retention improvements due to training were dramatic and paid the cost of the training many times over. even before any performance differentials were considered. Employees referred by existing employees tend to stay a lot better. So employee referral is an important predictor. Mentoring programs usually improve retention for both the mentee and in one study we did with Sun Microsystems, the mentor as well tended to stay longer if they were mentoring someone. I guess it gave them more of a connection to the company. Tuition reimbursement programs have a good track record of improving retention. And I felt particularly compelled to mention this one as there's a popular HR folklore that paying for someone's education motivates them to grab their diploma and run out the door. And a lot of research says that isn't the case. Of course, the best thing overall to know is to measure your own numbers. We strongly suggest impact studies in your own organization to establish these points one way or another. So I'd like to sum up, talk about what are some of the important things I hope you can take away from my presentation today. First is that retention and turnover are different things. That employee loss can be good, bad, or neutral, may or may not be avoidable. So be sure to measure the bad and avoidable cases the most carefully. Demographic breakdown is a very important thing to do. Of those demographics, tenure is usually the most important of those. Turnover is expensive, and the costs come in a lot of different areas for that. So measure your own costs, but believe me, they're pretty high. And there's a number of special tools that you might have to study turnover and retention, such as exit interviews, existing employee surveys, the study of the ROI on special programs. Thanks very much for letting me speak to you today on the business impact of turnover and retention. I have a book out, again, available from Amazon that deals with a lot of these questions more heavily, or feel free to contact me. But at this time, Mahalo, do we have questions from the audience that you'd like answered?
Still waiting for the questions. So there's one question came in, and it says, are you really allowed to use demographic data to steer improvement?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the converse of that is that you have demographic responsibilities sometimes to maintain a diverse workforce in terms of race or age, for example. You can give it your best effort, but without the analytics, you're working blindly. I would say, for example, if you had a serious turnover problem among African Americans, you might want to drill into that because that information could come out in a different way. It's best to be proactive about it. I think Stela made a point earlier that you can't necessarily look at the data, and data and statistics are about what a flock of people are doing, not what the single bird is doing. So you can't say, excuse me, you're between 40 and 45, you're a male that has a master's degree, we've determined you're a flight risk and we're not going to promote you. You can't do that with individuals. So I would say that's an inappropriate use.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there are a couple of my questions came in, or rather a comment. Is the demographic question really depends on the country? I think one of our listeners commented. The question is about technology. What are some of the technology platforms or systems used to perform your own workforce analytics function?
Well, I don't think there's a single platform out there that lets you do that. It's usually a question of pulling from a number of platforms, such as human resources information systems, like SAP as an example. Some of it may be pulling learning and development information. Some of it may be pulling operational and performance data. Once you get a hold of the data, I like the R programming language a lot. Other people use SPSS or SAS. I don't think a lack of facility with advanced tools should dissuade you at all. I will almost guarantee you that if you can use an Excel spreadsheet for simple things, you can probably do a better analysis of your company's T&R issues than what's being done currently.
Mm. So it's not necessarily technology, it's really asking the right questions and using the right data That's what matters.
I said I love advanced analytics and statistics, and big data, but low-hanging fruit and simple data, small data is very important to consider.
One more question came in. How do you present a turnover data when the cause is a good thing?
When the cause is a good thing? I've heard the word top grading being used in high turnover environments to imply that you're simply keeping the best of the employees and getting rid of the inferior ones. I've seen that in sort of low wage, high turnover situations. That may be one way to present higher turn rates positively.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Boyce, for your time this afternoon.